All right. Thank you again, everyone. Please bear with us while folks filter into the webinar. It'll just take another moment. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for this timely discussion on data and social justice. Really excited to have you here for what I think will be a really interesting conversation. My name is Albert Cahn, and I'm the Executive Director of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, which hosts these monthly conversations with RadTech. RadTech is a meetup offering monthly workshops and teach-ins on the intersection of technology, social justice, and community. And my organization, S.T.O.P, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, focuses on the growth of warrantless surveillance technologies and other forms of mass tracking at the state and local level. And we have an incredible guest with us today. Dr. Seeta Peña Gangadharan is an organizer and activist who is situated in the academy and working closely within communities. She addresses policies and practices related to digital inclusion, privacy and collection, and data-driven technologies on members of marginalized communities in the United States, and justice, equity, and technology, which explores the impacts of data-driven technologies and infrastructures on European civil society. So a lot of different focuses in this area. She is a associate professor in the Department of Media and Communications at London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also been a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and Data and Society Research Institute, New America's Open Technology Institute, and the School of Media Studies at the New School. Quite a list of affiliations, and one of the forces behind one of my favorite projects in this field, which is the Our Data Bodies project. So Seeta, thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Nice to see people joining.
And I wanted to start off by asking, what do you see the impact of the US presidential election on systemic surveillance of BIPOC communities here in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, that is a timely question. I almost feel like because I'm outside of the United States, peering in from the United Kingdom, I don't have the full scope of everything that's really been happening on the ground in the run-up to the election. But it does seem like there have been myriad ways in which political campaigners, both above ground and underground, have been targeting particular groups, you know, both online and offline. And I think that that's going to possibly expand in ways that we don't totally know what the strategies will be, but certainly there's now, I think, an even stronger effort at targeting, harassing, and yeah, basically being abusive and violent towards Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to be all dark and negative, even though that's how I'm personally feeling. But I do think that you know, there have been several quote unquote innovations that seem to have unfolded over the last few months in terms of trying to target people. I mean, what I have just seen from afar is just, you know, kind of issues of infiltration and yeah, just strategies to fragment and disrupt people's lives.
And I want to sort of delve into what you mean by innovations. What sort of changes were you thinking of that you've seen during recent months?
Gosh, I mean, I don't think this is not an area that I'm an expert in. So, I mean, I can sort of speak broadly to what I mean by that. And I think this has been the case for the last 4.5 years, which is at least on the right and the far right. There seems to have been pretty interesting efforts to coordinate. That's led to, just both vigilante action as well as action that seems kind of vigilante-esque, but is actually behind the scenes extremely coordinated. And I mean, if you really want to go back to what the word innovation is, it's tied to this idea of dissent, right? Dissenting from a religious authority. And in some ways, I think the right, writ large, has really, over the last few years, thought differently about how to coordinate action and practiced a type of coordinated action that is, both borrows from left activist strategies and builds upon them in ways that I don't think many of us had expected. So I can just sort of broadly paint that picture rather than identify specific innovations. But it's certainly the case that, oftentimes, again, being in the United Kingdom, looking to the US through the lens of, myriad news reports and tweets and whatnot, it does seem like there's a shift that's happened. That's not to say on the side of progressives or in the left there haven't also been innovations. It's just that there's a degree of coordination that's taken place that's kind of surprising. So you have the sort of political coordination that's characteristic of the right, which is party unity and blah, blah, blah. But then you have this sort of vast expanse of social movement activity that is also really good at needling, at being divisive, at, again, disrupting people's daily lives in ways that are traumatic and oppressive.
Yeah, no, very much so. I think it's interesting hearing you add that caveat about observing this from outside of the United States, because I feel like when you're observing it within the United States, we're so fractured at this moment that you can have that same perspective of not knowing, of almost being an outside of observer of your own country in a real time because of how differently these trends are unfolding in different parts of the country and in different political silos and different sort of online silos as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch on the activism point. But before I do, I just wanted to invite all of those who are tuning in to this event live. We're going to have it posted as recording afterwards, of course. But for those of you on the webinar, could you please feel free to add your questions throughout using the Q&A panel at the bottom of the screen. We really want this to be as interactive as possible, and we'll try to reserve as much time as we can for your questions throughout. So when you look at the sort of activism you're seeing both on the left and on the right, one thing we've seen a lot of in our work here at S.T.O.P is sort of activism related to community surveillance and some of the ways that we've seen activism pushing back against systems of mass surveillance. But we've also seen activists leveraging new online platforms and systems that can tap into that same ecosystem of surveillance. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit to what you've seen in terms of the relationship between technology and activism.
I mean, technology is a power tool, right? It cuts both ways. So, yeah, in the work that we've done with our data bodies, I think that that tension and that contradiction is always there, right? You know, I, for years, worked at this place called New America's Open Technology Institute, and we had a number of kind of open source technologists that were part of the team. And this is not just characterizing my former colleagues, but I think the movement in general, that sometimes, you know, there's a, it's almost like a technological purism, right? That you need to only use things that are open source, or you need to use free software, you need to use tools that are created by people that are against surveillance infrastructure, surveillance capitalism, et cetera. And then at the same time, right, you can't only function in that world, right? So in our data bodies, we've taken, you know, we've done this sort of research and organizing project since 2016, and we've been relatively low profile. We haven't actually used traditional social media platforms to get our word out. It's sort of by doing the work, we kind of thought that we would get known. But at this juncture, it's actually sort of like, oh, why aren't we? I mean, should we have more of a presence? You know, should we evolve to a point where we're becoming more and more dependent of, obviously, individual members, including former co-founder Tawana Petty is, you know, very active on Twitter, has an incredible presence, and you know, is very fluent and visible in that space. And yet, both, I think, Tawana and also people that we've interviewed over the years have said, right, like, you want that visibility, you want to be part of that infrastructure, because that's where people go to be seen and heard. And yeah, that comes with all of the dangers and risks and harms that are endemic in those infrastructures. And yeah, so it is really difficult to be a purist. But at the same time, I feel like we should try better, right? We should not actually use Zoom all the time to do our meetings online, which is a point actually that was made even more palpable for me during the lockdown in the UK, the first lockdown, because today is the first day of our second lockdown, where, you know, I had to teach online, and my Taiwanese and Hong Kong students wouldn't actually use Zoom. And that wasn't just a principled move. Actually, that was really necessary, right? Because, yeah, there are direct consequences that can follow. And so, I mean, I think as activists, we do need to be thinking about that and constantly aware of when we can pivot in that space, when you need to use alternative platforms, alternative technologies, alternative modalities for connecting and communicating to one another, because actually we don't always need these digital technologies as much as I think we say we do. But just to come back to the point of, yeah, community activism, right? That term in and of itself, right? It doesn't automatically speak to a technology, right? There obviously are technologies of activism. I mean, if you want to get really philosophical about it, but I think the point is, how are we connecting? How are we creating bonds? How are we creating trust? And some of those things aren't easily mediated.
Completely. And I think that's such a crucial point about platforms like Zoom, for example, which maybe are not as, you know, controversial as a platform like Facebook would be for many audiences. but by using these platforms, we not only empower these corporate intermediaries, but we do exclude certain voices and certain participants, and we enable the sort of, censorship we've seen when Zoom has, canceled certain events taking place on their platform because they disagreed with the viewpoint of the speakers, or the statement was critical of the company. And
Yeah.
that creates a really dangerous choke point on public discourse when we make these technologies even more central to
Yeah.
public life.
I mean, I'll say one more thing, which is, a lot of the writing that I do as an academic is around this idea of refusal and technological refusal. And it's an idea that I've developed in part inspired by the work of Ruha Benjamin, who was writing about informed dissent, not just informed consent or informed refusal. And others, Indigenous scholars and other scholars in STS who talked about this with respect to medical research. But it's important to recognize that technological refusal is neither absolute or, sort of this totalizing, like, political gesture. It's actually a point of political reimagination, right? So if you refuse Zoom, if you refuse Facebook, if you refuse Google, right, it's not like, I mean, some people do join these sort of detox tech movements or delete Facebook movements, but it's not so much as an absence as a presence, like creating a transformative presence and using that moment of refusal to really rethink what are the kinds of institutions, the kinds of practices, the kinds of norms that you want to bring into possibility. And so, yeah, you might be eventually coming back and using the platform of, big tech, but you've started to shift your thinking and sort of design a path forward for doing things differently. And I think that's really important.
Definitely, especially when we live in an age where these platforms are given monopolistic power. And so it becomes increasingly difficult to completely carve them out permanently from your life. But having that ability to re-engage with them on the terms you choose, to perhaps temporarily leave them, or permanently, but to try to have a counterbalance to that sort of corporate power that we see when Facebook is allowed to buy up all of its rivals and try to become the only social network. It really, we have to find those sort of individual responses. I'm thinking a lot of what Zephyr Teachout has written about this sort of antitrust concern with the large tech platforms in her recent book. But it's something that regardless of how the presidential election turns out, we're going to be dealing with this sort of structural concern for years.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one question we often get, and I want to get your thoughts on it. Actually, before I do, just want to remind everyone again, please feel free to submit your questions. Really looking forward to seeing what's top of your mind. But one item I wanted to sort of delve into was the linkage between carceral surveillance and surveillance capitalism, and how do the systems of these technology platforms potentially link to the power of the state to jail us, to arrest us, to use those broader policing powers. Do you think the two those two threats can be disaggregated, or do you think there will always be a linkage?
Yeah, I do think there's always a linkage. And all right, the question is, how can you dismantle carceral surveillance, because carceral surveillance is tied to racialized capitalism, which encompasses surveillance capitalism, right? I mean, you don't actually hear about that in, Shoshana Zuboff's book, but I think we can draw some pretty direct connections between racialized capitalism and surveillance capitalism. So, for me, and again, I think there are others that are, more expert in carceral technologies or carceral surveillance than me, but the things that I think about in terms of how do you actually couple these two things, some of the first thoughts go to like understand the market dynamics, right? Like think like an investor, right? If I'd be looking to expand markets right now, actually it seems like a very favorable moment because the pandemic is, surveillance is the language of the pandemic. So you can think of carceral technologies sort of moving to a distinctive market to a wider market. And yeah, once you start thinking about the market dynamics, then I think the next question is actually to think about what are some of the least visible techniques that are practiced in order to expand these markets. And to try and learn from these. So one of the things that I've been wondering about recently is how do you sort of position technological refusal in relation to strategies of financialization, right? Which is the process by which companies become even bigger, right? And that's not just in the United States, but that's in like China's technology strategy has been all about this, which is really fascinating and a really important place to learn from. But in terms of, sort of challenging the nexus between carceral surveillance and surveillance capitalism, I think it's really trying to think about, okay, that really difficult moment, that difficult spot where things are the least visible and the least accessible, for example, to people that are affected in a daily fashion. Like, how do you actually make that link between the lived experience of carceral surveillance and this invisible practice that's expanding the market for carceral technologies, right? Like, what is that meeting point? And, I think that, I don't know if we've gotten there. I mean, certainly there has been a lot of excitement about the different ways in which communities are organizing, whether it's in, Minneapolis or in Oakland or in Detroit or in Los Angeles. Like, it has been genuinely exciting to see how communities have galvanized because, actually they can draw a line, but how can we draw that line even further, right? So as to really expose this connection between racialized surveillance capitalism and carceral technologies in ways that I don't think we're doing right now. And to address the question that came in the chat, sorry, you can ask those questions in the Q&A, but I think abolition is actually really critical to that perspective. And I'll just say, like, if it weren't for my work on our data bodies, I don't think I would have really come to understand what this abolitionist framework really is. And now I think about this in just new ways, right? Like, it wasn't actually until Hamid Cahn of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, like really just he and I having a deep conversation, like I just couldn't get my head around it. Like, sort of suburban kid from New Jersey, middle class, like went to elite colleges, like have always been drawn to this work and have always done work in a coordinated fashion with communities on the ground. But still, like, abolition wasn't part of my vocabulary, but now it feels like, actually, you know what, this is really important. Like, this is more important than I could have ever imagined. And so thinking about how do you insinuate that perspective, right? Like Angela Davis is writing on abolition democracy. Like, how do you insinuate that perspective in sort of the transformative change that needs to take place in order to dismantle racialized surveillance capitalism? And I think that is really key. Like, part of that abolitionist framework is really, like forcing us to reconsider like basic terms, like, what does it mean to work? Right? Like, what does it mean to live? Right? What are these institutions that are defining both life and work for us in ways that don't actually conform to basic sense of dignity or safety or belonging in society? Like, that's the transformational work that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think, it's so important, especially as we see sort of industrial scale warrants where it's sort of, we all, at least for us lawyers, we always talk about warrants and how important warrants are. And then you start to see how it just becomes a rubber stamp for mass surveillance and how, especially with new, surveillance tactics like geofence warrants and where they can use a single court order to surveil an entire community. It's sort of like, okay, so you check that legal box, but it doesn't actually protect anyone. It's not actually a safeguard at all. And so you really have to abolish these systems if you want to prevent that sort of abuse rather than creating another sort of checkbox procedurally. But I really want to thank Kate for submitting that question. Would love more questions from the rest of the audience. And I think that the issue you brought up around COVID-19 is crucial as well, because we see a lot of these vendors who had been marketing their tools as being a way to keep us safe, quote unquote, in a law enforcement context, now being repurposed, oftentimes the exact same technology, as a way to keep us safe from COVID-19, but without any evidence it works in many cases.
Sorry, I'm gonna let my Instant Pot beep write its beep out. Okay, phew, all right. So yeah, you might have to repeat a part of that question, but I think what you were saying was, yeah, just to point out like what is sort of the extension of this surveillance infrastructure through managing public health. And I guess it's frightening. It's truly frightening, I think. Where do I want to go with this? I mean, like two thoughts. I still have an afterthought from thinking and talking about abolition and sort of the rule of law, and just thinking about this historical moment that we're in where, yeah, the forces of sort of systemic control and systemic oppression are profound, right? They're profound, and they're bearing themselves in ways that I don't think we've quite seen, them manifest themselves before. And, that just the idea that now that there are these services that are being offered by tech innovators to help us manage a public health crisis. I mean, it's a way to undo the already fragile democratic safeguards that we do have in place, right? And to think that so much of public health surveillance or public health management is being outsourced in ways that make it harder to see and detect what's actually going on is, I think, bodes poorly for the future, right? Like we're just creating dependencies in ways that seem completely anti-democratic. And I would hope that that we could learn from other places. Because I have had a number of students from Taiwan, I'm like, and understanding it's an island and it's small and all of that, right? I get it. But I feel like the debate that they had in the years after SARS, right, about health surveillance is potentially a great model, right? It was a long discussion. I think their Communicable Diseases Act was passed in 2003 or something like that. And right, that's a long time till now. And lots of concerns that surfaced through that. But I think they're in a much better place today as a result of that really vigorous debate and struggle that took place. in a country that has all sorts of threats, right, looming on the horizon. And yeah, I would hope that we could learn from them to understand the importance of both engaging many different kinds of stakeholders, not just looking for that shiny silver bullet, right? Not investing everything in this, you know, completely idealistic or sort of caricature of innovation, right? That actually you really have to do the hard work and labor of working through legitimate forms of health surveillance. And I wouldn't even call it health surveillance. I would just call it public health at that point, right? It's just about public health. I'd like to keep the term surveillance for the negative or pejorative meanings that I think it's embodied over hundreds of years.
Completely. Yeah, completely. And I do think it's very, having that vocabulary clear as we're dealing with, you know, different forms of data collection, which can have positive use cases in some, but can also be, you know, misused by government agencies. It's, yeah, we really are, we're just in the infancy of a lot of this. But I want to turn to a question from our good friend Ali Funk, who brought up the amazing work being done at the local level around the US to push back against, you know, biometric surveillance. We've seen bans on it in San Francisco. We saw a ban on both government and private sector use in Portland, Oregon, and actually on election night we saw a citywide ban on facial recognition pass as a ballot initiative in Portland, Maine. And Ali wanted to ask whether you're seeing similar local conversations and movements around the world, and just what your thoughts are on how to build global solidarity, because it seems like a lot of the most, you know, impactful work on biometric surveillance is happening at the local community level, but we're facing the same fight, you know, around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this. So I'm in the UK. I'm in Europe. I still kind of feel like an outsider. I mean, I guess that's the European way, but you know, I think that like that question comes up time and again. And I will say that from, you know, being here, we do really look to the US as inspiration. Like we look to what's happened in LA, and you know, though it hasn't been fully successful in Detroit, we look to what's going on elsewhere throughout the United States. And people here are really galvanized and inspired by that kind of ground up movement. And at the same time, I think that, you know, like it feels funny to be saying this, but like the culture of activism and organizing in the US is so unique. It's like a complete outlier, right? Like the history that it has existed in the US that has developed this really distinctive form of organizing and activism, like those conditions don't, and those cultural and historical reference points don't exist for everyone outside of the US. And so, you know, finding others that are doing similar work, it doesn't always look the same way, right? So for example, in Europe, there's already here in the UK, there's a group named Stopwatch UK, which has done a lot of work around stop and search and prevent, which is the anti-terrorism policy here. And they have looked at surveillance, and they do connect with groups like Liberty UK, which is focused on obviously surveillance and civil liberties, as well as groups like Big Brother Watch, right? But like there's already it, like being from the US, there's an aspect to it that feels really different. Like you don't have lived experience as centered as it is at home. I'll call it home, right? So that just means like, I guess part of building that solidarity is really thinking and acknowledging and being okay with those differences, right? Because sometimes it's going to seem like it's pretty not elite, but it's just different, right? Like it's not always coming from the ground up. Now that may change. I mean, that's one of the aspirations of the Justice, Equity, and Technology Project, right? Where we are recognizing, like, actually there are groups on the ground that are experiencing stop and search and daily harassment because of Islamophobia, for example, or xenophobia more generally, which is really strong in parts of Europe, right? Like, actually, those people are part of the sort of well-respected or funded civil society, right? Like they're kind of outside of that. And I think there does need to be a broader effort to bring those two things together. Now, sorry, that doesn't totally address Ali's question, which is like, where is that international conversation taking place? I mean, I haven't really seen it happen systematically. Like, again, in Europe, I think the Justice, Equity, Technology Project is trying to do an aspect of that. There are other groups like European Digital Rights that's trying to do an aspect of that. Like, there are groups, but, you know, I think some of it's gonna bubble up. But I'd be happy to connect with you if you want to continue that conversation, because I think there are several of us that are thinking like, actually, if we just analyze the markets for surveillance technologies, like we can connect between different cities where things are happening and look at how different groups or different affected communities are intersecting with these issues and build a strategy of solidarity from that perspective.
Yeah, I think this would be a great conversation to continue. We have some exciting work coming up with international partners early next year, where we're going to be trying to connect those local municipal campaigns. But that's just going to be 5 cities to start. And I think that really what we're seeing is that we need to build the infrastructure of global solidarity from communities around the world to fight back against a lot of these forms of technology. All right, so we've got 2 more questions, but I would love to see more folks have other thoughts. And so these get into a bit more on the technical side. So first one comes from Marina, who talks about, you know, how like a lot of users, she uses a VPN to try to protect browsing privacy, but there are a lot of sites that will block you from accessing them if they detect that you're using a VPN or using Tor to access that site. Any thoughts on how the best way to access those sites while also preventing tracking?
So hard question. I'm laughing and smiling only because it's such a hard question, not because I'm, yeah, happy at the question or the subject of the question. But yeah, I mean, I also think that probably somebody like Matt Mitchell, who was one of your guests recently, would be better equipped to answer that question than me. I mean, what do I use personally? I use Avast to clean my computer and to, yeah, just implement certain kinds of anti-tracking software. But yeah, Matt Mitchell actually suggested a few other tools, including something called Macapaw, because I have a MacBook Air. But, you know, I think there are certainly, you know, whether it's the crypto parties still ongoing or Equality Labs is a group that I pay attention to. And oh my God, I'm just, because it's the end of my day, I'm blanking on them. Tactical Tech in Berlin, right? Like these are groups that I pay attention to because they're certainly more up to date than me in what's good and what's not good.
Yeah, and if you Google how to contact Matt Mitchell securely, it will bring you to a post on ways you can contact him with security questions. And we do have our earlier presentation with him as well that available, and we'll repost a link to that. Additionally, Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, has their Security Education Companion that goes into some of these issues as well. But it really will vary from site to site when if you're seeing your IP address essentially being flagged because you're using a secure service to access that site. And with Tor in particular, which was included in the question, sometimes by rotating your exit node, you can avoid that issue, but it really depends on the website. All right, so Chris S. asks, let's see, do U.S. authorities have as easy a time obtaining warrants from VPNs as they do from companies like Google?
I mean, I feel like, Albert, you're probably better equipped to answer a backdoor question than me, but yeah, I'm trying to remember, right, what is it, the seven, I always want to call it the Seven Sisters or the Five Eyes.
Five Eyes, yes.
Sorry. But yeah, there are, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name of the person who used to keep an incredible list of all of the VPNs and which ones were actually subject to sort of these requests by the 5 countries that are part of this Five Eyes agreement.
Okay.
And I'm blanking on his name, but that's probably also a Googleable thing. Yeah. How easy is it how easy is it for US authorities to gain access to VPNs? I think it would depend, at least my understanding is it would depend on what, how they're positioned in relation to this Five Eyes agreement. And, you know, there are certainly VPNs that are like Switzerland, right? And they try and get outside of that jurisdiction. I know that Molvad was one of these groups that I think really tried to sort of be outside of that jurisdiction, but I don't have the figures on how frequently this happens. That's probably something that, yeah, again, like a digital security person would know.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's no centralized reporting for how many requests the various VPNs receive for, how many subpoenas and warrants and other like national security letters they receive. Google publishes its transparency report, but that only discloses the number of requests that Google itself receives. And, so for smaller VPNs, or any VPN that doesn't publish that information itself, we really don't know. And so generally, if a VPN is based in the United States, it's subject to US law, and the records can be obtained via US court order, state court order, warrant or subpoena, depending on the type of information. And even if it's outside of a Five Eye jurisdiction, we have, information sharing agreements with other countries that, would enable us to access that information potentially. But yeah, I definitely, we use a lot of products that are based in Switzerland because Swiss data protection laws make me very happy. And so there are a number that can be helpful there. But one thing to flag with a VPN is, a VPN hides your internet traffic from your ISP. It creates that layer of encryption between you and the people you're paying for internet service, and that's great. But it doesn't prevent the VPN operator from keeping a list of every place you go, and so it still is a potential point of vulnerability for your internet activity. All right, our next question comes from Ali. How do we convince the general public to be wary of surveillance technology, especially those who don't face policing and surveillance in their communities? Particularly with the private sector, it seems the ability of tech companies to push forward with more and more invasive surveillance is the lack of resistance from people who may not understand its future impact. So
yeah,
a bunch of good points from Ali.
So great set of questions. I mean, I guess within the context of our data bodies, we sort of we came to our research questions about, so our research questions were like, how do data collection and data-driven systems impact the ability of marginalized people to meet their basic human needs? And like through that question and through the work that we did, we kind of arrived at the point where we said, like, actually, you know what, people do know. And it was like sort of a flip or a twist, right? Like, we didn't assume that people needed awareness. We actually assumed that they started from a place of knowing. Now, that may not always apply to everyone in the general public, or people that don't, for example, have to suffer from systematic forms of domination and oppression, right? Like, you're not thinking about things in the same way, right? Like, I mean, often the worst it can get, or the expression of frustration, is like, that's annoying, right? Like, it's so annoying that I'm being tracked in this way, right? But sometimes it doesn't get worse than an itch, right? And I think that I've wondered about, like, these different frames that are in circulation, and how there might be fatigue around identifying the problem of surveillance with the word surveillance, right? So, just 15 minutes ago, I was talking about how anti-democratic, right, like surveillance infrastructure is, as tech companies come in and they offer a service to manage a pandemic problem, right? Like, anti-democracy is the frame there that I think could work better than surveillance infrastructure. Similarly, I think we could explore where just basic notions of freedom are going to carry more weight than, like, surveillance and control. Even the concept of liberty, right? I think there's something to be said about, like, identifying these, basic terms that aren't always associated with the groups or advocates, at least, those of us who are working on issues of marginality, or, working in and with highly surveilled communities. Like, we wouldn't always use those terms, but I think it's important to circulate between these different framings of the issue, because actually that's what makes surveillance so insidious, right? Is that it sort of insinuates itself into different forms of being, and affect just, like, our daily habits in ways that we wouldn't necessarily identify. But being able to speak people's language, I think, is key, right? Like, without that, you start to wonder if you're being too, like, pedantic, or you're being too, like, you've just lost that conversational ability to just talk about an issue that, it does affect everyone. Like, the worst forms of surveillance, and the most egregious surveillance experiments that are being conducted on refugees and asylees, right? Like actually, there is, again, you can draw a line between that and sort of consumer surveillance, commercial surveillance, right? Like, everyday surveillance of quote unquote ordinary people. Like, there isn't that much of a distance, but it is about the language that you use.
Completely agree with that. And just a reminder, we'll have time for probably one or two more questions, so make sure to get those in while you can. But I think that language, that storytelling of the human scale of impact is so crucial. And one thing I've seen some success with is just, especially in the aftermath of all the horrific police violence and police killings we've seen this year, just being able to have people understand that Ring doorbell doesn't just mean that you're getting a video feed, but that possibly means that there's a bigger risk that your neighbor, especially if they're Black or Latinx, is going to be, have the police stopping them, have that risk of police violence, have that risk of death, even that comes with every police encounter, just because you had that extra surveillance system. As we've seen with facial recognition, a faulty facial recognition match really can be a matter of life and death. And so those impact and scale, I think, is so important. All right, so our next question from our own Fabian Rogers are, what are some analogies or layman's terms, phrases that you've used in the past to connect with folks while trying to understand the issues of surveillance tech?
Yeah, so I'm not in my office because my partner is banished to the top floor because he's self-isolating. But I would at this moment show you a physical copy of the Digital Defense Playbook, which is the work that we compiled over, I guess, really like almost 3 years of talking with folks out in neighborhoods in Detroit, Los Angeles, and Charlotte. And it's really like, we're so proud of that work. And we do know that many of those activities that are in that playbook would still be relevant today and still be a way to like just tap into, like people's everyday experience of surveillance. And what we've found, and that's great if you share the link to the playbook at the end. What we found is that actually, these kinds of activities travel well, not just, in the communities we are from and care about the most. Actually, when we go into these, like, because I'm an academic, right? Like I go to these academic conferences and I have like the playbook and engage people in an activity, and it really does get people talking and thinking and narrating their own experiences in ways that I think are really helpful. So the playbook itself is we have all sorts of activities, one of which Tawana came up with this activity where it was like, what's in your wallet? Like take all of the things that are in your wallet. We might not be able to do that activity so easily in the near future because of electronic cash becoming hegemonic, but it is a really simple activity. Take all of the cards that are in your wallet and see which kinds of information you need to give up in order to transact. Right. And so like what ends up happening is like people will take everything out of their wallet and they'll be saying like, oh, I have to give like this biometric detail or to give this geographical piece of information. And then the only thing that's left in their wallet is like their coffee card, right? Like, or their sandwich card, right? Like, it's fascinating. And then it gets just people thinking and talking about like, okay, well, oh my God, what do we do about that? Right. And it's really nice because it's a conversation starter that's done in such a sort of almost intuitive fashion. Like, yeah, just like look in your wallet, look at your everyday objects. What do you see? What can you read from that? And what can move you on the basis of your experience in that activity? So, yeah.
That's incredible. And I definitely think that that's an activity that we could all replicate so easily. We just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask, there's so many, surveillance threats out there. There's so many ways that these tools are invading our lives. What makes you most hopeful doing this work? What makes you most hopeful about sort of continuing this in the months and years ahead?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't do the work unless I had some degree of optimism. But I mean, what I'm writing now, sort of coming out of ODB, like writing a manuscript that is capturing aspects of the work, and of course, that work is traveling in other ways. I think that's really, really important. But one of the things that I've been trying to do is really put myself in the position of thinking affirmatively. So if we know we don't want these kinds of marginalizing surveillance or racialized surveillance, as well as other forms of surveillance, like what is the thing that we do want, right? Like how do you actually articulate that? So again, not only criticizing like, oh my God, liberal democracy is like basically turned itself inside out and gone up its own anus and out, like, right? Like it's just kind of inverted itself in ways that are so dangerous and like destructive. Like from that destruction, like what can we actually rebuild? And I think, this is my ongoing sort of journey and exploration of this concept of abolition, right? Like as we abolish something, what are we creating? And, part of that thinking process comes from like just also hearing the stories that people told us about, like, basic aspects of safety and belonging that people are yearning for, right? When you're unhoused and you have to pack up your things every day because the LAPD or the street cleaners are going to come and clean the streets in order to prevent undesirables from being on Skid Row. Like just thinking about what is the hope and vision that they've articulated. And it really, it's about basic fundamentals, right? Like safety and belonging, right? Just very clear. And so just thinking about how to articulate that in this work, in this ongoing work, I think is a real, it's an inspiration, and it's, and it evolves, like sometimes it changes. And I think that's what keeps me going. Like that's what makes me excited to be challenged and, to confront the dark days. And I really believe in this form of intergenerational transformation, and to recognize that, like, I'm one person in that journey. It's not just me. It's like really engaging in this transformation over time with others.
Well, that's such a lovely note to end on, and thank you for sharing your fight for safety and understanding with us today. And it's something that it really and I'm such a fan of the work you've done. So looking forward to seeing how your scholarship continues. And I'm grateful that you could be a part of this conversation series. So thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. And we'll be back later this month for our next installment in the S.T.O.P RadTech speaker series. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see each other again soon. Thank you.